Next up, we're joined by Rebekah Taussig, Kansas City writer, teacher, and author of the new book, Sitting Pretty, A View from My Ordinary, Resilient, Disabled Body, out from Harper One. Rebekah earned an MA from UMKC, where I teach, and a PhD in creative writing and disability studies from the University of Kansas. She has led workshops and presentations at the University of Michigan, the University of Kansas, and Davidson College on disability representation, identity, and community. She also runs the Instagram platform @sitting_pretty, where she crafts mini memoirs to contribute nuance to the collective narratives being told about disability in our culture. Her essays appear in Ash Magazine, Good Company, and have won the Creative Nonfiction Editors Award from the Florida Review. Rebekah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
It's great to have you with us. In your book's preface, you write that social media has the power to destroy, but simultaneously offers, I'm quoting here, at least one tremendous gift, the power to share a story without going through the gatekeepers who've historically said, pass. We don't tell those kinds of stories. Who would listen? Can you talk a little bit about those gatekeepers and how social media has disrupted them and their patterns?
I think one of the beautiful things that I've seen happen online is disabled people being able to see each other and recognize that they're not alone. I think when you grow up with a disability or you become disabled, a lot of times it's easy to think that you are really the only person in that boat or one of the very few people in that world. And part of that is reinforced by the stories we have around us that don't represent that experience. But suddenly online, people were able to see each other and hear each other and see each other's stories in each other. I know that like Erin Clark was one of the first people I found online with a disability, and the things that she wrote about her experience in her body, it was like, I didn't even know words like this could be written. Like I didn't know that this was a story that anyone could tell or that anyone would care about. So I think seeing each other in that space was really important. And then I think that this other thing happened at the same time, or maybe just a little bit behind, a little bit of a lag, was that industries started to recognize that there really is a vibrant disabled community that translates into an audience or a consumer, so we have publishing industries, film industries, but also fashion industries and advertising agencies recognizing like, oh, there's a whole population here that maybe wouldn't have been seen as a demographic worth keeping in mind as much in the past. And I think the momentum of that community building online has been really transformative. Like we're watching that transform things in real time right now. So in a way that I think is really exciting.
I mean, that's had an effect on your career. There's that, we'll put this in our show notes, but you're on this, Bustle has a list of 10 body positive Instagrammers with disabilities you should immediately follow. You're on there. So I immediately have followed you, but that was already because I knew you.
You're just taking notes from Bustle. What should I do, Bustle?
But you know, speaking of the tropes in literature and film that you're talking about, you think of films like, I mean, a very old piece of media that's also been filmed, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, or, the Forrest Gump character, or, in the movie My Left Foot, Daniel Day-Lewis acts as someone with cerebral palsy, even though he doesn't have that cerebral palsy. I feel like it's sort of really rare, and people are still debating this. I mean, there's a debate going on with Sia right now that I just saw, speaking of social media, and a movie that she's making. That there's still, whether or not these characters should be played by people who have the disability that's being portrayed. How far and there's also, you talk about representation. So how far do we have to go to get sort of what you would consider to be equal representation for people with disabilities in media?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And I think, there's a lot of things happening simultaneously right now. Like on the one hand, I think we do still see these glaring tropes showing up all over the place. I think that's not going away easily or anytime soon. I'm thinking like even films that I really love, like The Shape of Water that came out a couple of years ago, or what would be another one? Even Get Out, which is a gorgeous, important film, have some of these disability tropes kind of tucked into them in a way that doesn't even always get a lot of attention afterwards.
Can you give an example of some of those tropes?
Yes, absolutely. So like in Get Out, we have a blind villain who essentially will do anything within his power, even commit atrocious acts of violence to reverse his disability or get his eyesight back. And that's a really common trope that you have. That's also like the Pikachu movie that came out with Bill Nye as the villain. That's the same thing, right? You have like the disabled supervillain who's going to destroy the world in order to get his body back, which is not so unlike the trope that you see in The Shape of Water, where you have the protagonist who is mute, she doesn't speak, and there's this trope, this fantasy sequence where there's a whole scene where she acts out and she sings and she performs using her voice, right? And so that's a really common trope. You see that, that's like a trope that showed up in Glee, that was a trope that showed up in The Theory of Everything, where you see the disabled character kind of have this little flash of a moment where they get to fantasize what it's like when their body's returned to, its abled, normal state. And so, yeah, those tropes are tucked in and showing up just as much as ever, I feel.
That's so interesting, because I feel like when you're going through, I'm like, oh yeah, but I feel like I'm like, well, I can see and understand, like we talk about the trope of like the villain who is repressed homosexual, right? Like that has been, people know not to do that, right? I hope so. But I do think the tropes you're talking about are less thought about, to be perfectly honest, by ableist writers.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think I think what that shows us is ableism is really pervasive, and you don't have to be, it can show up anywhere. You can be a disabled person and still write an ableist trope. It's really prevalent. But I don't want to overlook the things that are happening to move us in a different direction. I think, like, I look at the show Special. I don't know if you all have heard of Special. It was written by Ryan O'Connell as a memoir originally, and then Ryan wrote the screenplay and actually performed in the show on a Netflix series called Special. And it's just his story of being a man with cerebral palsy and gay, and kind of coming to terms with his own identities and exploring his sexuality as a disabled man. And it's a beautiful, brilliant, charming, funny show on Netflix that has, I think, gotten some good attention, and people are watching it and enjoying it. So like that show, the fact that that exists is very exciting. It's something new. It's a move in a different direction, I think. So I think both of those things are kind of happening at the same time. And obviously my idealism is going to say, I think we're moving towards, better, more complicated, interesting representation and away from some of these old stories. I think I hope that that's where we're going. I think it seems like the better route for lots of reasons.
It's funny, when you were talking about this, I'm just thinking back to, this sort of guy. I grew up in the 1980s and spent all this time watching terrible 1980s films. And when I go back and revisit them, like, they're so frequently racist. There's always like a homophobic subplot. I'm like, Adventures in Babysitting. Who remembered that you had a homophobic subplot? But you do.
Yes.
Or Goonies, which is like actually rife with ableism. And completely. As a kid, I would never have like noticed or I don't know, thought about it. And, I don't know, Disney also. But then also, like, as you're talking about this, the range of things that are disabilities is so large. It seems like also people are often using race and gender as like proxies for how they could think about disability, but it doesn't seem like it would work. Do you know what I mean? Like, they're trying to sort of make analogies for, I'm trying to be more sensitive about racism, more sensitive about sexism, more sensitive about homophobia. But like, for example, I feel like now I know the term neurodivergent. I'm trying to think of like, when did I learn that term? How old was I? Probably pretty old. But that term, like, all the language is there's such a large range of vocabulary that we don't know.
One of the news pegs that we have for this episode, because we're a news and literature podcast and we're talking about disability in writing, but is the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we just talked with Molly McCauley Brown a little bit about that. I wondered, that act, so it's 30 years old, as I just said, right? The movies that we're talking about, Forrest Gump, were right around sort of that, so it was 1990. So Forrest Gump was probably, I can't remember, was it before 1980 or after 1980? Was it a 1980s movie or was it?
Oh, I think it was
a
after.
1990s
I
movie?
think it was the 90s.
I think it was after. I think it was the
Yeah.
90s.
Okay,
Yeah.
so look, these tropes and their use in movies didn't immediately go away upon the passage of this act, right? I mean, this act had a lot of changed physical things in the world, but they didn't change necessarily the way people think. But I wonder what role you think that act has played in this ongoing conversation or improvement of the way that people, if there is an improvement in the way people have been discussing this issue of how people with disabilities are represented in the media.
That's a really good question. And it's come up a lot this year, the ADA. What has it done and what is left to do? And I think ultimately the ADA, it's like two things at the same time. It is this amazing, magical, amazing piece of legislation that changed everything and also left so much left. There's so much left that needs to change. The fact that it exists at all is amazing, and also there's so much that's left untouched by it. And I think, in particular, just culturally, I don't know that the ADA did very much at all. I don't know that it did very much at all to change attitudes or understandings. I think that it literally allowed disabled people to be in classrooms and in buildings. And in that sense, I guess you're actually seeing a few more disabled people in the world around you. And that's not small at all. But in terms of people taking the ADA to understand that disabled people should be included, and we're lucky to have them be included, right? Like that this is like a valuable group of people that should be here. I don't know that translated through that piece of legislation. I know for me, I have literally had conversations with people grumbling about the ADA to me, which is very strange because I think of all the people that you would feel uncomfortable grumbling about the ADA to, the person who obviously needs it to get into your building and be one of them. But there's such a, I think that there's a pretty deep-seated resistance to the ADA still, with a lot of folks. I mean, that's clear even just like a couple of years ago. I think it was 2017, there was a new piece of legislation that almost passed to kind of undo some of the work that the ADA had done, and it got through the Senate, I think. So I mean, like that is pretty clear evidence that culturally there's a lot of work we have left to do to understand the point of what the ADA is even there for. So in terms of how that's translated to representation, I don't think that it's done very much, honestly. I think what has done a lot more in terms of shifting our cultural understanding. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I value writing and storytelling more than most things in the world. So I have a tendency to think that stories are really powerful, but I do think that what we see in literature and in film and in social media with people kind of telling their own stories or shifting the stories that we have about disability, I think that's the most powerful thing to changing our cultural understanding of disability, and by extension, our built spaces and our legislation and the actual lives of real people.
So you're talking about all of the ways that the ADA hasn't done enough. And I think, yeah, people don't seem to understand really what disability and accessibility mean. And able-bodied people haven't had to say no to affordable apartments without elevators as you have, and they haven't experienced the discouragement you felt in realizing that all the accessible apartments in Kansas City come with spectacular price tags. The incidents that I'm mentioning come from the chapter in your book called What I Mean When I Talk About Accessibility, in which you move out of the house you share with your best friend when she gets married. I wonder if you could read a little bit to us from that section.
Yes, I would love to. So yeah, this section is just in the middle of the chapter, and a big part of that chapter is trying to find an accessible place to live and kind of bringing the reader through what that actually ends up being like. And as a disabled person, I knew it would be hard, but honestly, the real life experience kind of took me off guard. So just starting kind of in the middle of this chapter, I pinpointed my parameters. It had to be affordable on a graduate student budget. Can we even call it a budget when the paychecks are that small? And I had to be able to get in and out of it. If I could move around the space without enormous barriers, that would be cool. Not the most demanding parameters the viewers of HGTV have ever seen, I imagine. I started asking around to my mom and my sisters, my closest friends and their boyfriends, my boyfriend and my dad. Have you heard of any places? Do you know of anyone moving? Have you seen any for rent signs? And they'd send me Craigslist and apartment.com listings and track down leads from friends of friends. Joe and Bertie spent a whole afternoon driving around town visiting places with me. I had a whole network of loving, smart people on the lookout. Something had to materialize soon. We visited affordable apartments with dirty bathrooms and carpets, one accessible unit per building that might be available in a month or two, and no accessible parking. There was the unit that was advertised as accessible, but actually had street parking on a steep hill and trash bins located across a street with no curb cuts. After a few months of looking, there seems to be three basic categories of housing. Places that were affordable but inaccessible, with parking, laundry units, and bathrooms I couldn't access, and a nice sprinkling of stairs. Or places designated for low-income disabled people with waiting lists in the hundreds. I've had my name on 3 waiting lists for subsidized developments like this in Kansas City, and my name hasn't reached the top of any list in 4 years. One place actually sends me letters each year asking whether I want to keep my name on the list, and I keep saying yes, because by the time I actually make it to the top in 10, 15, who even knows where I'll be or what I'll need. Or places that were brilliantly accessible with sleek floors, wide doorways and elevators, and spectacularly unaffordable. After several months of scouring the internet, my then boyfriend Micah and I, we hadn't known each other for even a year yet, decided to drive up and down the streets of Kansas City and all its sprawling pockets, looking for any place that might work. Maybe there'd be a magic unicorn building hiding behind a big tree, we hoped. That night, we drove around, listening to Vampire Weekend's new album and talking about my upcoming French exam. The hours passed as we made our way across the city, but we hadn't spotted one place to look into. Seemingly out of nowhere, Micah started crying. How is it possible that this city doesn't have any place for you to live? Oh, don't worry, it's okay, we'll find someplace, I said instinctually. I rubbed my hand in circles against his back, willing the weight of inaccessibility off his shoulders. But it was a burden I couldn't lift. What Micah had believed to be a series of annoying inconveniences revealed itself as a reality much gnarlier, more powerful, and consuming. This wasn't a pesky problem to bat away. It was a problem that defines and dictates. As Bertie started to move her stuff out of our house and into her new home with Joe, I had to come to terms with the fact that despite the collaborative efforts of all my people, I still hadn't found a place to live. I secretly wished Micah would ask me to find a house with him. Our combined incomes would allow for more options, but even as I hoped for it, I felt gross for wanting the progress of our relationship to be determined by my housing situation. So that spring, as I bought a bridesmaid's dress for my best friend's wedding, I moved back in with my parents at the age of 29. This was simultaneously a great relief and a profound defeat. On one hand, I was so grateful to have a place to go. This is not the case for many folks, a reality that felt closer, but still hardly fathomable to me. Had I not been caught by this net of support, there are other ways this could have gone. Folks are often forced into homelessness, nursing homes, or subsidized housing far away from all that's familiar to them. They can feel like a burden staying with relatives or friends. Sometimes they stay in horrible relationships because they need shelter. I was keenly aware of this. On the other hand, I was embarrassed and deflated to be moving back home at 29. I was burrowing into my childhood bed each night, staring relentlessly into the glow of late night Craigslist searches. It didn't help that the only bathroom I could access in the house was in my parents' bedroom. I'd get home late in the evening and sneak into their dark room, listening to my dad's snores and trying not to bang my chair into their antique dresser. Micah would come over to watch Netflix in my childhood bed, and my mom would bring us a bowl of popcorn and a plate of apple slices. Did you forget that I was almost 30? Yeah, me neither. The longer I lived there, the more ashamed I felt. I'd drive home from a day of teaching, pull into my parents' driveway, and feel about as capable of taking control of my own life as a tween.
Rebekah, thank you so much for joining us. We want to encourage our listeners to pick up a copy of Sitting Pretty and check you out on Instagram at sitting_pretty.
Thank you so much.
See you later.
That was really fun. Thanks. Take care, everybody.